It's actually spring. I think it's actually spring. It was 70 degrees the other day. I went out of the house with a jacket on, and it was completely unnecessary. It was the most beautiful thing. For our Muslim friends, we're in the month of Ramadan. Today is Good Friday. Beautiful thing. For our Muslim friends, we're in the month of Ramadan. Today is Good Friday. The show is pre-recorded, so sadly we won't be able to take any questions at the end, but hope you are just enjoying this wonderful time of year. And we've got all sorts of interesting things to talk about today. I got so many comments that the HubSpot blast that went out was clickbait. And I was like, no, it's not clickbait. They're actually devices catching fire. They're actually igniting. We're going to talk all about that and more coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. All right, and next up, we're going to talk about the upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem, brought to you as always from culling through all these different organizations, their event pages and things that we get from various email feeds. The whole point here is to bring things to you that are interesting to this community, the MedTech development community, those involved in developing, investing in, supporting, and using medical technologies. That's who we try to reach out to. And of those upcoming events, let's see if we can get the slide to advance. Of course not. Technology never works. We're going to go on to this one from MichBio. I know MichBio is right in the middle of leading an effort, sort of a national effort from the state of Michigan, which is really cool to see. But not to lose sight of things like this. April 11th, they're having the IP and legal expert virtual coffee break. So if you want to connect with a lawyer to talk about intellectual property or other legal questions, what a great place to go and do that. Every second Tuesday of the month from 11 to 11:30 a.m. you can get to that and scan the QR code if you're listening online. This from FDA, the logo says TOP, which is the Opportunity Project, which is from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, as well as the U.S. Census Bureau. We've talked a lot about how will we use data in this country? How will we aggregate data? How will we get data? Of course, COVID made this very front and center because you couldn't really know what was going on. They were doing their best. I mean, there were some amazing efforts underway, right, to aggregate data. But at core, you sort of knew that it was based on a shaky foundation of where was this coming from and what about a home test? How do you get that data? You don't have that data. And so they are talking, they had one on March 29th. And they have one coming up on April 11th, FDA and the Census Bureau, to talk about uses of data for improving health. Talking about what kinds of tools can be developed. They want to talk about problem statements, roles, solution teams, advocates, product advisors, data stewards. They call this a sprint. They have a 12-week period where they're going to be talking through all this and trying to get people engaged in this process to get ideas flowing around. So it's neat to see them trying to be proactive in this. It does take someone central to generally create standards. We're going to be talking more about standards today. But from a data perspective and a diagnostic data perspective, this should be interesting. Coming up on April 11th. Also on April 11th through 13th, the 10X Medical Device Conference in San Diego, California. That one billed as a fun networking event. April 13th, not MedTech specific, but some of these events by Ann Arbor Spark are just so cool. You just need to know about them. The Secret to Startup Success, the Customer Discovery Event Series. So take a look at that if you have any questions about customer discovery. And then a webinar coming up also on April 13th, Marketing Submission Recommendations for Predetermined Change Control Plans. We talked last week about predetermined change control plans for artificial intelligence. And if you want to hear from the FDA directly, this would be a great opportunity on April 13th. What are they expecting for these predetermined change control plans? For risk management, RAPS at their global headquarters is running a risk management for the full product lifecycle event. It's a 2-day event, April 18th and 19th. And then back to Ann Arbor Spark, the pitch competition for the Entrepreneur Bootcamp Celebration. They are having, their boot camp is coming to a close, I guess, and they have a pitch competition that's part of that. So if you're looking online, scan the QR code, you can get connected to that. Back to wraps again for Cybersecurity Unauthorized in April. There is a event happening, talking, again, 2 days. These are pretty in-depth coverages that RAPS is doing. And this one is going to be just a few days after the last one at their global headquarters. The MedCon Conference is coming up at the end of this month, Columbus, Ohio, April 24th through 27th. We're going to be there. Looking forward to bringing you coverage of that. Definitely an amazing industry conference that happens every year in Columbus, Ohio. And oftentimes a lot of industry folks as well as FDA come together for MedCon. More on artificial intelligence from RAPS, the foundations of AI. If you're interested in AI, but you don't have the technical chops to really get deep into it, this might be for you. Wednesday, the 26th of April at 11 a.m. That is going to be a free event from RAPS, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, put on also by Schlafender Hasse. I make myself try to say that every week. I don't know why I do. That Schlafender. German, I guess? That's what I'm thinking. And then AdvaMed has a 510K IDE and PMA Submissions Workshop happening May 15th through 25th. It's actually 3 workshops. So if you want to go deep into these 2-day workshops, you can scan the QR code and get connected with AdvaMed. Like we said last week, my goodness, there are so many events happening now, we can really only tell you about the next month or two. After that, there's so much coming up that it's not worth regurgitating it all just yet. So we will have more to tell you on that coming into May and June next week. But for now, those are the events that we're talking about. Next up, FDA and Industry News. All right, so this is a fascinating one. You don't like hearing about things having problems in the market, but it's always instructive to learn from them when you do. What you're looking at here is Abbott's Freestyle Libre, if you're looking online. And if you're not, I'll describe it for you. There's about 4 things in this picture. One is a cell phone that shows your glucose levels with a little chart and are you in range or are you not in range? And this Libre is a continuous glucose monitor, and it's widely distributed. There's also a monitor device that has a similar screen on it that I suppose talks to your cell phone. Graph, number. Then there's a little puck, and it turns out this puck has needles on it, or a needle on it, and this adheres to your skin. We'll show you a picture here in just a second. And then they have an applicator device. This is the applicator device up here in this corner. And that's how you apply it. Here's a picture of how you apply that. This lady here has got it on her back of her upper arm, and she is she's actually looks relatively happy, even though she's about to jam this thing into her arm. Hopefully they got the needles optimized. But right here, the applicator allows the device to be placed, and you end up with a adhesive patch stuck to your upper arm that with a needle in your arm that is continuously monitoring glucose. Amazing technology. Really, really cool. And of course, it takes other technologies to make this work. You've got to get the needles right. You've got to get the battery right. You've got to get the communications right, the data transfer, the data analysis, all the sorts of things that you'd have to do to leave this on a person for an extended length of time. So that's really cool. But here we see FDA Class 1 recall. Abbott recalls the readers used with the Freestyle Libre 14-day and Libre 2. So that's, if we go back to this, that's number 4 in this picture right here. It's this reader that is having trouble. Why are they recalling it? Why is it a Class 1 recall? The most serious type of recall may cause serious injuries or death. Well, and there's 4 million of these out there, 4.2 million of these devices. Why are they recalling it? The system's reader devices, which use rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, may get extremely hot, spark, or catch on fire. if not properly stored, charged, or used. Get this, with its Abbott-provided USB cable and power adapter. We're going to focus in on this in just a minute here, this aspect. What does it mean to properly charge it and use it? Well, you got to use the Abbott-provided USB cable and power adapter. They go on to say that potential for overheating, spark, or fire may occur when charging the reader with non-Abbott adapters or non-Abbott USB cables. Well, that's interesting. So wait, hold on. You're telling me that if I use a USB cable, but it's not your USB cable, my device could catch fire? Yeah, that's what we're saying. I'm going to pause here because I want to do a little show and tell. We, in our own practice here at Into Being, in our conference rooms, we like to have these kinds of, and we've blacked out the name. We're not trying to be mean to anybody here, but these little conference room speakers, right? These are great little things, and Bluetooth is always a hassle, right? So here's a USB-C cable coming out the side of it. Very, very convenient. You can plug this USB-C cable into anything, and you should be able to use it as an audio device and talk on your Teams calls and your Zoom calls. Everything's great, right? And, it does work some of the time, but it's incredible how often it doesn't work. And this is not true of just any one device, so we're not throwing anybody under the bus here. But so many times you plug it in and, oh, it didn't work on that USB port. Here, let me try a different one. Oh, look, it worked. Or it doesn't work going through this device, but it works going through another device. Why would that be? I mean, we're looking here at this USB cable, and here's an iPad. I could plug it into this iPad. My laptop's over here. I could plug it into my laptop. It's going to fit. It's going to go, right? So what is the deal here? How can it be that this device that seemingly is following a standard so frequently doesn't work? Have you experienced this in your own life where it's like, oh, well, yeah, that USB cable doesn't work? Steve, you and I were talking about this beforehand, and you were pointing out to me that, like, even though the standard might talk about what the tip geometry of a USB cable is, and Steve's our electronics guru in addition to being a video guru, you were saying that things are not always what they seem. What's going on behind the scenes with something like this?
No, the problem is USB-C has tried to put itself in the market as the one connector to solve all interaction between things.
Yeah.
And it's trying to do too many things with one port, if you will. And that leads to problems because sometimes you get a basic USB cable that might have come with a phone or something, and all it does is supplies your traditional USB 2 wires. So it'll do, the 480 megabits, just standard power and signals. Other cables might have extra wires in them that support the USB 3 specification, which is faster. And other ones yet will support the Thunderbolt standards, which is what a lot of the docking stations use, which again use even more of the pins and wires in the connector.
And we think about support. A lot of us will go instantly to software and we'll think about software support, but we're talking about the actual wires inside of this connecting the two ends of it. Like, those are not always what they seem to be.
No, and then it gets even more complicated, especially with power, because now there's all the laptops that'll, charge through USB-C. So that USB cable for charging can now provide anywhere from 5 volts if it's just running in a standard USB.
Oh, interesting.
9, 15, 20. And there's even some extended standards that may allow in time up to 48 volts on that USB cable if the device it's connected to requests that high a power.
Wow. And we don't know whether the devices here were using USB-C or USB or whatever they were, but the general principle here is, even though this end, and of course here's USB-C, which is, you can flip the thing, right? Traditional USB, you couldn't flip it. It was one directional. Yeah. But you handed me this just before the show, and this is fascinating. There's a cable here. It's an adapter from USB-C to USB 3, I guess. And even though USB-C can be flipped either direction, you can take the plug and you can turn it around either direction and it'll work. This one, they had to physically key so that the USB device only goes on one way, which means that those connectors and how the wires are routed aren't actually as flippable as it seems like it should be.
No, well, the wires themselves aren't flippable. The reality is that the host device that you plug it into is smart enough to sort out which wires are going where by the direction it's plugged in.
Oh, gotcha.
And when you're converting it to a standard USB, your traditional Type A port there, you lose those smarts because it doesn't have those extra control signals. So it needs to be orientated correctly at that point.
That's fascinating. So I think the upshot here is that when you see these beautiful little standardized ports, whatever they may be, USB-C or any other, sure they fit, but it's not a guarantee of what is traversing between those. Are all the wires there? Are the standards underneath the hood still in agreement with each other? It's
And yeah,
something we don't think a lot. Sorry, you're going to say.
like I said, we haven't even touched all the display standards that go over USB-C as well, because you can put HDMI, DisplayPort signals over those as well. But again, not all ports support all of that.
And that's, yeah, it's kind of incredible. I think as consumers, we certainly don't think about it. As designers, we do, right, at Into
Yeah.
Being. But
So in particular with USB-C, you've got this weird subset of the cable has to have the right parameters, the right properties to work, and the port does that you're plugging into. So you've got two places of failure, which results in a lot of confusion, much like with different medical devices.
And when it's my phone, I mean, you sometimes worry about buying the wrong cable and having your phone, stop working, or maybe I'm going to short it out or something like that. But this is a medical device. Abbott down here reporting 206 incidents, including at least 7 fires. That's non-trivial. Now, it is 4 million devices, so granted, that is a small subset. No deaths, but enough to cause a definite problem. Here's what caught my eye. If we come down here, they say stop using the Freestyle glucose monitoring system and switch to a backup method if you do not have the Abbott provided USB cable and power adapter. Let's take a look down here. I'm going to find the page that we pulled out. Yeah, here's from Freestyle Libre's website. They actually have a recall website. They're doing a good job of getting the word out there. If you go to the Freestyle Libre web page, they sell the device, but they also have a thing right at the top telling you, hey, here's what you should know about this. So good job there. But notice this, storing the reader yellow USB cable. I don't have a lot of yellow USB cables in my stockpile, but it's almost like they knew that there was something different about this cable, and felt the need to call it out. So if you don't have the yellow USB cable that came with your Freestyle Libre, you shouldn't be using it because you can blow the battery up. And I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, it must be a battery problem, right?" But that. Why do batteries actually blow up, Steve? It's not usually the lithium pack itself.
Well, it's usually something is charging it wrong, or charging it too fast or to too high a voltage, which can result in gases building up within the battery, and that'll cause them to bloat, which if you've ever seen like an old cell phone or laptop battery that's bloating, that would be gases that have built up in the battery, often due to overcharging. And in theory, I believe some of those gases are potentially flammable, as is some of the other chemistry. So if it got hot enough, it could combust, and has been known to happen.
And that's kind of what we're up against there. So I've got to believe that there's a bunch of swollen Libres out there too that just didn't happen to catch fire. That would make a lot of sense at this point.
That's potential. That, or in their USB power and charging, they did not follow standard specifications somewhere, and the combination of yellow USB cable and their power adapter was their solution for some design deficiency, if you will. And that's their solution is if we only use it with our accompanying stuff, it could be maybe a fault. It could be anything. It could be a miswired connector. It could be a faulty charge controller, which they move the charge controller into their power adapter and use their special USB cable as a crutch there to make it work.
And of course, sometimes solutions need to be implemented, but this does seem like one of those cases of reasonably foreseeable misuse. Like somebody's going to grab a USB cable that's not the one we shipped because they have them lying around. Is that safe? Now, of course, sometimes you know it is, and sometimes you don't know it is. So, time will tell what comes out of this. But 4 million devices in a recall, that's quite a few. And so good to know. But if somebody's using a Freestyle Libre, you can let them know. The number 2, I think, is the one that is under recall.
Yeah,
You were going to say something,
it'll
Steve?
be real interesting in time if we learn what the root cause of this failure and fire risk was, or is for that matter.
Yes. Yeah, it would be absolutely fascinating. I don't know if we'll get that information. For those who have loved ones using CGM's continuous glucose monitors, that's the Freestyle Libre Flash Glucose Monitoring System, Freestyle Libre 14-day Flash Glucose Monitoring System, the Freestyle Libre 2 Flash Glucose Monitoring System. And for those of you engaged in the development of medical technologies, going out there, maybe you're making wearables, maybe you're making diagnostics of different sorts, anything with batteries. I think there's 2 things to think about today. One is reasonably foreseeable misuse, and how important that charging circuit is. It's not something you can just take for granted. I was having a conversation just the other day with somebody who we were talking about, with the pressure to reduce the size of devices. Companies will go, hey, we did something. We grabbed some Arduinos and we grabbed some things off of, Adafruit, and we put it all together. And that's cool. It's really important to do proof of concept. There's no knocking that whatsoever. But having done that, it's that actual development work to reduce the size, to make sure things are working, to actually make sure that the risks have been mitigated, that has to be done. And sometimes things do slip through. So we don't know, like you said, Steve, we don't know the actual root cause here. So we're playing armchair quarterback today. But a fascinating failure. And I appreciate your expertise there as well.
Glad I could add a little bit here to the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it always. Well, this is a fun one too. This is a DIY automated insulin delivery system. DIY. It's a not-for-profit grassroots DIY community around this Tidepool name. It is now a nonprofit. They have developed a diabetes data management app that actually does control hybrid closed loop automated insulin delivery app for compatibility with multiple insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors. They've got some collaborations, but the CEO's statement is actually quite spot on. What we submitted was different from other AID solutions on the market because our submission did not depend on proprietary insulin pump or continuous glucose monitoring hardware that we develop or control. Now, in this article from Drug Delivery Business News, a mass device resource. But in this statement, in this article by Sean Woolley, that one statement from the CEO belies, he makes it sound easy, but that belies an awful lot of work. Here's the problem. When you go to FDA and you say, we want to be compatible with other devices on the market, FDA says, okay, that's fine. That happens all the time. What's your interconnectivity standard? Here we are a minute ago, right, talking about USB cables that should have a standard and still can't talk to each other. And when you have a device out there that may or may not have a standard, and you say, we're going to connect to it, FDA says, fine, but you're going to have to prove that you can connect to it. That takes a lot of work. Oftentimes a lot of logical work to say, here's the ways it could fail, and look, we've mitigated them all. So a lot of kudos to this company for making it through FDA with something that is so interoperable, or at least that FDA has recognized as such. And what's cool then is that you can control these other automated insulin delivery systems using this device. So they have an algorithm. There are certain compatible integrated continuous glucose monitors and pumps. And so it automatically increases, decreases, and suspends delivery of insulin based on those readings. This is also a fascinating statement in Sean's article, where he says that the system can now serve as a predicate device for future interoperable AID submissions. That's a really important note, too. Sometimes you're out there and you're trying to blaze a trail and somebody beats you to the punch. Well, that can be disappointing. But at the same time, it means that you don't have to solve all the problems they had to. Did they take the blow for you, or are they going to beat you to the market? That's not always a immediately obvious question to answer. And we just had something like that happen recently, where you suddenly discover somebody's on the market, and it's like, well, how did they get there? And then you go, well, this might actually make our path easier, and we think we have a better solution. It's the classic beta max versus VHS question. In that case, beta was better, but VHS beat them to the punch. So these things turn out in different ways, but it certainly does change the landscape. I think that's the upshot here. This really does change the landscape, and it makes the recognition that it is possible to have interoperable automated insulin delivery systems. Next up, opioids. Do you remember back in 2018, FDA was reaching out. I think the pandemic got in the way of us thinking much about this. FDA was reaching out and saying there's a public health crisis of opioids. Now, the problem is that these are mostly prescription, right? These are things that we're giving people during routine surgeries. And so while they are a real blessing to have for pain relief, people get addicted to them and they can overdose on them. So FDA put out a challenge: devices to prevent and treat opioid use disorder. I believe this is 2018. And a number of companies here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, were, they got 250 applications. 8 of them were selected for this challenge. One down here, Masimo. They didn't even say what the name of their device was, but it was an overdose therapy device. What happened? Well, here's what it is. They actually have released it. It is called the Opioid Halo. And I think this is a fascinating case study for us in the community, because they've taken relatively normal things that Masimo makes anyways, and they've combined them in a way that does a diagnosis that's beyond what they would normally be diagnosing. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this looks an awful lot like a pulse ox, right? Same kind of fingertip technology. And they got a base station, and it talks to a cell phone and all the usual good things. And they are shipping it in May for $249, apparently. Good for them. Neither endorsed nor promoted, et cetera, et cetera. So they got a mobile app, they've got a home medical hub, they've got the tetherless sensor that, as we said, looks an awful lot. They're even using the same brown tape that you use for a pulse ox down here. So what is this thing that's monitoring and warning and sending notices out? Well, here's what it consists of. It's an adhesive fingertip sensor, a reusable pulse oximeter, and Bluetooth chip, the hub, and the smartphone app. Cool. Why? What does it have to do with opioids? How did we succeed in diagnosing opioid overdose with that? Well, here's what they say. This from MedTech Dive. Credit to MedTech Dive for this little description. Because opioid-induced respiratory depression is associated with a low respiratory rate and oxygen saturation, they're just taking their technology and applying this to it. So they have an algorithm to determine when the vital signs indicate that a patient may be at risk of respiratory depression. So when the patient is moving, when the hands are cold, the data from the sensor can indicate a risk of respiratory depression. The first thing it does is it alarms to facilitate self-recovery. If the risk continues to rise, it can call designated friends and family members, or ultimately call a service center, which can lead to EMS being dispatched. The market for it is people who are taking prescribed opioids. So you already know as a precondition that the person using the device, this isn't diagnosing opioid overdose in a random person. This is diagnosing opioid overdose in a person who is taking opioids. We know that they are. We're monitoring them for it. Because you don't have to boil the ocean, right? You don't have to look diagnostically and say, oh, this person could be healthy, they could be on nothing, but we're going to see if they're overdosed. It's not for that. It's for a specific situation where you know they're taking them. You just want to see if they've had too much. But these might include patients who are recovering at home after surgery. They say individuals who are using opioids illicitly for non-medical purposes. I'm sort of wondering about compliance in that case. I can see the case where somebody is, at home and the family wants to keep an eye on them. So this is a really fascinating application of existing technology that they realized that respiratory rate and oxygen saturation in a particular configuration are associated with respiratory depression, and that's brought on by opioid overdose. So in this case, what we really have is something that's looking for respiratory depression, but we know the patient was taking opioids, so now we are ready to run in and see if that was indeed an overdose. So neat thing to see that some of these coming out from FDA's challenge back in 2018 are making it to the market, and apparently kind of a cool little niche there. So it's good to see. Well, our friends at Phillips just can't catch a break. You remember that the CPAP machines and the foam, the PEPUR foam debris, were a big problem. Then you remember this. This isn't even our news item. This is a month ago, though, 2 months ago, where their ventilators were also starting to be implicated with the foam, at least a particular subset of the ventilators. I think it was ones that had been reworked. So again, don't take that as gospel truth there. But there's 13,000 of those ventilators added to the CPAP recalls. Well, the news gets worse. Here's another brand new Class 1 recall for Phillips. This from MedTech Dive as well, from Elise Reuter. Their Trilogy Evo portable electric ventilators. This isn't foam-based. This is an internal sensor that can lead to an under-delivery of oxygen. So they're already up against 5 million sleep apnea devices and ventilators being recalled for foam problems. But now they say that the accuracy of the delivery might be below tolerance, according to FDA. Specifically in this is the interesting part to me. It's the accuracy of delivered oxygen for high concentration oxygen therapy. So, in fact, if you're doing it at low levels, it sounds like the device is giving what it's supposed to. But if you're doing it at high levels where you need a lot of oxygen, that's where it's not giving enough. So it's sort of the worst of all worlds, because it's going to be low. It's going to be giving too little oxygen in this case. It's only 63,000 devices, quite a number still. And they're looking at it. They're going to release a software update, they say. That'll take some time, I'm sure. But the solution for it is that they need to monitor the patient's oxygen saturation levels and use an external oxygen concentration monitor. So they're basically saying, you can't trust this device. You need to monitor the levels. We'll give you a patch for it as well. But poor Phillips, I think I read recently, I'm not going to cite the numbers because I'm not sure I'm 100% on it, but that they just had a whole nother round of layoffs due to these challenges that they're up against as a company. So unfortunately, not a great place to be. It all gets back to this question of, did you do what was necessary to understand if the device was safe and effective for use? Sometimes you can't get everything. So it's just the reality that some things are gonna slip through, some things that you couldn't test for, you couldn't predict, you thought you had nailed down. They do sometimes. So that's just part of the game. But some of these high profile ones where millions of devices are involved, especially when deaths and other things are involved, I think it's important that we learn from them because they teach us where we should tune our gut, right? Where we should say, you know what, I could see that happening. Where should we be looking for something hiding behind the rock, as it were? And this is another one. Obviously, why would it have been released without the high volume numbers being tested thoroughly? Don't know, but it's worth reminding ourselves that that's an important thing to do so that you know the device is going to work when it gets out there. And that's the end of our news items for today. I thought it was going to be a slow week in FDA land, but in fact not, and lots of good case studies here. So if you're out there and you're investing in, or you're working on, or you're working with new medical technologies, hopefully this gives you a little bit of an insight into what sorts of problems are being faced, what sorts of things you can be on the lookout for, that as people are trying to deliver care, they don't get sidelined by some of these problems that show up from time to time. And obviously the complexity of modern electronics and computer systems, it just makes this hard. It's hard to chase down every last thing. But it's important that as a society we do, because the promise of these technologies is they're going to improve lives, not that they're going to get pulled from the market for problems that in retrospect feel like they could have been solved. But again, can't judge too harshly. Just have to take the lessons and move forward and try to apply it to the projects that you find yourself working on. Well, with that, I want to wish you an absolutely wonderful day. Enjoy spring. So glad to be with you today a little bit. I'm sorry it had to be pre-recorded, but we'll be back with you live next week here on MedTech Crossroads.